Nancy knows. That,
We're who would have thought
played softball with.
This time.
You really in relation to her or not.
that someone, a country, would do what Russia's doing to Ukraine? You know,
Well, they've got, I mean, if you look at it from their point of view, they only have 2 gas pipelines going to Europe. One of them goes through the Ukraine.
How many do you need?
Well, the thing is, they cut their income in half, and their income depends heavily on that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we used to be, owners of that country. Of course, they starved them to death. Man, a famine with 20 million dead.
Yeah, Stalin killed a ton of them.
Yeah. That's why the Ukrainians fought with the Nazis against the Russians. And that's why the Russians call them Nazis, even though their president is a Jew. It's terrible.
80 years ago.
Yeah, I know.
Forget it.
Well,
It's over.
it's like when they were, when the U.S. Army went into Afghanistan and Iraq and those things. They tried to sit down with the tribal leaders and just rough.
I think they
Just
probably.
came on.
Yep, we're ready now. I think they probably. Steve's got 2 kids now.
Warm up there.
Tim.
Steve's on active duty.
Yeah, Dave's on it. Well, he's been gone. He was never involved in it. He was gone.
Oh, okay.
Tim was working on his fish. I don't know whether he's doing postdoc yet or not.
Nuclear.
Yeah, he's I guess it's nuclear engineering.
See his picture in the paper, but, there's a run for autism or something like that.
No, Steve?
Yeah, this,
Or Tim?
Tim, he's 6 foot.
Oh,
3,
yeah,
6
yeah,
foot
yeah.
4, big
They were all
guy.
tall, but they progressively got taller. I think.
Compared to back in the old days, he was the little runt.
No. Yeah. I worked out there until I hurt myself. I realized that I'm too old to do this.
Trying to be Arnold Schwarzenegger and get on there and.
No, I'll be honest with you. They showed us here. We need you to do, now you go through these. They have this, I don't know what it's called, but it's a circuit of exercise
Stations.
Different every time.
Mm-hmm.
And had to do one, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but you're basically hanging with your feet locked around something, and you do reverse sit-ups.
Mm-hmm.
I hurt my back, and
All right, it's after 10. I'm going to start talking, so you have to stop.
He doesn't ever.
if you're just going to throw me out, then
Unless it's related to Sunday school or the announcements.
it could have been announced.
Yeah, I guess that makes it a little more vague. All right, announcements. Calling all graduates. If you have a graduating senior in your family, let the church office know. They're gonna, publish the graduate names in the first light coming up in June 14th. So, a pat on the back and a little bit of recognition for our soon-to-be graduates. Well, our soon-to-be graduated. There's a trustee meeting on Tuesday, May the 10th at 6 p.m. in room 105. If you don't know, that's on the same floor as the sanctuary, just straight down the hall and straight through the door, past the steps.
For those that have been here for a while, that's where the old office used to be.
Where the old office, yes, but predates my time here, so I didn't know that. Ecumenical Storehouse, Saturday, May the 14th is our time to do pickups for donations that are coming in, and that takes place between the hours of 9 a.m. and noon. Sometimes they're done a little earlier depending on how much is donated, also depending on how much room they have in the storehouse for those donations. So, but anyway, it's pretty much always done by noon, with only a few exceptions in my experience. So any questions, call Jim Williamson about that, but that's May the 14th, Saturday. So then we have our May fellowship table, which is coming up the day before on May the 13th. It's always on a Friday, and that's from noon to 1 p.m. down in the fellowship hall. Anyone in the community is invited. It's a $5 per person ticket. And I've still never been to a fellowship table, but I have seen the food, and you get way more than $5 worth. Plus, it's delicious. I've been fortunate enough to eat some leftovers, from time to time. So again, that's on May 13th.
It's a wonderful time for fellowship too.
Yes, it seems to be. I have, walked by and seen the fellowship going on, but I keep my lunch down there, since I'm here during the day, and so that's why I go down there. But the main entree will be Mexican tacos and casserole, which sounds pretty good. VBS training. So all Vacation Bible School volunteers are required to take this training. It's going to be provided on 2 different dates. The first day is Sunday, May the 22nd at 10 a.m. And this training is down in room 105 also. And then the second opportunity for that training is Tuesday, May the 24th, so 2 days later at 6:30 p.m. So you got a morning opportunity on Sunday, May 22nd, and then an evening opportunity to take the training on Tuesday the 24th. But again, if you're going to support VBS, which many people here do, this training is a must. And it's May now, so this month our potluck dinners that take place before Wednesday evening Bible study are back in effect. So previously, pre-COVID, we always had a potluck that led up to the Bible study every Wednesday evening, and that has been put off for a long time now, like a couple of years, and so now that's coming back. So says there will be enough fried chicken for everyone at no charge, but bring your favorite entree, side dish, or dessert to share. That's exciting.
Is that not once a month? I didn't think it was every Wednesday. Does it say it's every Wednesday?
Oh, yeah. Did I say? I guess I did say it was every Wednesday.
Excited.
Yeah, I don't think it's every. I don't think it's. Is it every Wednesday?
I think it is.
I think
It's the other fellowship that's once a month.
Yeah, the fellowship table is once a month, but the Wednesday night Bible study, yes, every Wednesday night, people always ate before the Bible study.
At least as it was previously, it was kind of BYO.
It was.
And,
Now the fried chicken thing for this one may just be a welcome back the potluck. I don't know, but yeah, typically it was bring your own, and it was just kind of it was a potluck. But okay, we'll figure that one out. And the last thing for the announcements is the Passport Kids Camp meeting, which is June the 5th at noon. And room 105. They'll be going over everything to do with Passport and what that entails. All right. Before we get started, I have another printed almost enough. This is basically the same printout from last week, but I added 2 more little statements that will be relevant while we're talking. You're welcome. And Joey, I don't have one for you. That's what I figured would happen. It's not that big of a deal, but it's easier to look at stuff. I think anyway, and for me it is. So I assumed it might be the case with you.
Go ahead and keep it on.
So last week we began looking at arguments for God's existence. Particularly, we began looking at the argument from Contingency, which is the name. The argument from Contingency is kind of a modern name that's been put on the original argument called the Principle of Sufficient Reason that was put forth by Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz's argument was much more complex and quite a bit more radical in what it claimed, and so recently modern scholars, particularly Stephen Davies, has simplified the argument and made it much more effective, I think. But the argument goes as follows. You've got your three premises and then a conclusion. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. The second premise is that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The third premise is the universe exists. So the conclusion, therefore, is that the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. And so this is a logically airtight argument if the truth of each of the premises is more, plausible than not if the premises are true. And, we started with this last week. We noted how pretty much no one is going to argue with the third premise that the universe exists. We're all pretty much sold on the fact that the universe does in fact exist. Except
for those who believe in the holographic universe.
Yeah, and even they believe it exists, and it would have the explanation is a hologram, I guess. But so that's not, you're not going to run into many people that would argue against the existence of the universe. So the skeptic is going to have to deal with either premise 1 or 2. And we offered a defense of premise 1 last week, and we saw that there are good reasons for believing that Leibniz seems to have gotten it right in distinguishing between the explanations of something's existence. Something either exists by a necessity of its own nature, or it exists due to an external cause. In other words, being is either necessary or it is contingent. A necessary being is one whose non-existence is impossible. It simply must exist. And then a contingent being is one whose non-existence is possible. It's entirely possible. It doesn't have to exist. We can imagine a world where this contingent thing doesn't exist. We used mathematical objects or mathematical concepts as an example of something that exists necessarily. And we pointed to essentially everything in the material world as examples of things that exist contingently. We also looked at the illustration by the philosopher Richard Taylor of going on a walk through the woods, and we find this ball there, laying there on the forest floor, and you would naturally wonder how that ball came to be there. If anyone just said, well, this ball just exists without any explanation for its existence, you would think it was a joke or that they were just wrong. It's not just the ball that this would apply to is what we're getting at. Any sort of object you might think of would fit the bill here. A tree in your front yard, or a car in the driveway, or a person you see at church, that sort of thing. In every case, we would say that there is an explanation for why this thing exists rather than not. And then merely increasing the size of the object does nothing to provide or remove the need for an explanation of its existence. So that leads naturally to the question then, what is the explanation of the universe? Since the universe would also fit this, it would fit in this question. You would have to ask, what is the explanation for the existence of the universe? And we talked about last week how a common argument made by atheists is that the universe just exists inexplicably, that it doesn't, there is no explanation for its existence. It doesn't have or need an explanation for its existence. They will sometimes say that premise 1 is true of everything in the universe. That is, everything within the universe, there has to be an explanation for its existence. But it's not true of the universe itself. Everything in the universe has an explanation, but the universe itself has no explanation. And as we pointed out last week, this argument commits a fallacy. And we talked about the taxi cab fallacy, where the atheist just dismisses the need for, an explanation when it comes to the universe. It was called the taxi cab fallacy. I can't remember who came up with that name, but it's based on something Arthur Schopenhauer pointed out, which is that you can't just get to your destination and then dismiss the argument once you've arrived. You have to. The argument applies even to, in this case, even to the universe. So the atheist just kind of arbitrarily makes the universe the exception to the rule without any sort of justification when they do this. Think again of the illustration of the ball, in the woods. Just because, the ball in this case is the size of the universe, that doesn't remove the need for an explanation of its existence. And the argument also commits the fallacy of circular reasoning, because the argument that the universe has no explanation for its existence assumes that the universe is just all that there is. But that just assumes that atheism is true. So the whole objection to the universe needing an explanation for its existence is circular reasoning. It simply assumes that there is no God, that there is no cause of the universe, and presupposes the truth of atheism. So, we can agree that if atheism is true, then the universe, it doesn't have an explanation for its existence. At least, you would never arrive at any sort of cause of the universe. That's not something that would need to have a cause itself. But the whole question is atheism true? And you can't just assume that it's true in order to object to Leibniz's argument. So if you ever do encounter this objection, don't let the other person get away with assuming that the universe is all there is, and that it needs no explanation for its existence. That just presupposes the truth, the conclusion that atheism is true, but without any sort of investigation as to why it's true. So, go ahead, Joy. I see your arm.
Yeah. Could you say, what counts as an explanation? Suppose someone wants an explanation for God, and you say, well, he's a necessary being. Mm-hmm. Isn't that an explanation?
Mm-hmm.
And so then God also has an explanation.
Yes. He's a necessary. That would be according to Leibniz's argument, according to the principle of sufficient reason, or what's, in modern times, the argument from contingency. And something that exists must have an explanation for its existence. And that explanation would either be in the necessity, that it exists necessarily, or that it exists contingently.
I see.
Okay.
I see. So those both count as explanations.
Yes.
And so why does the atheist not say that the universe is
a necessary entity?
Yes.
We will talk about that next week.
All right.
That does come up. It's not. It's actually, that's the first thing I asked when I encountered this. But it's actually not a very popular approach to trying to explain the existence of the universe. But we will talk about, how to think about that if someone asked that question or made that claim. Well, the earth, the universe exists necessarily. So someone could say that, though. That very legitimate question, and we will talk about that. So today we're going to move on to premise 2 of the argument from contingency. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. When I first read this argument, I was like, how do you just jump straight from, premise 1 to premise 2? It seemed really it just kind of seems to jump out of nowhere. It seems to be kind of, bold and daring. How do you go directly from premise 1, that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause, and then just jump straight to God as the explanation for the universe? Again, it seems like such a bold and daring statement. And so it puzzled me at first. But to my surprise, I learned that premise 2 is not, this premise is actually not one that the atheist will typically dispute, which I thought was pretty curious. Atheists do not dispute the statement that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And so you might wonder, well, why wouldn't they dispute this? It seems, again, like a pretty bold step to just right away you're jumping to God as the explanation of the universe. How does this go undisputed? Well, here's why. The reason that this statement goes undisputed by atheists is because it is logically equivalent to the atheist argument that the universe has no explanation for its existence. And this is where the part that I added to your handout will come in handy. Remember, the typical atheist response to Leibniz argument is if atheism is true, then the universe has no explanation for its existence. So that's A on your handout. The atheist says that the universe just exists inexplicably. We don't need an explanation for its existence. But that is logically equivalent to saying that if the universe has an explanation for its existence, then atheism is true. Hey guys, welcome. So A and B on your handout are logically equivalent. And so, I mean, hopefully you can see the logic there, but these two statements are logically equivalent. So, you know, and then if you look again at statement B, it's virtually synonymous with premise 2. And so for this reason, you know, atheists do not dispute the second premise here. They affirm that if the universe did have an explanation for its existence, then atheism would be false, which would make premise 2 more plausible than not. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I was hoping, you know, hopefully the handout, maybe if there's any questions. But suffice it to say that A and B there are logically equivalent, and B is synonymous with the second premise of the argument of the argument at the top there. So, you know, if the atheist did affirm that the universe did have an explanation for its existence, then that would make atheism false, which says that it doesn't, making premise 2 more plausible than not. And so that's one reason we would see premise 2 as being true and plausible, more plausible than not, which is what we're trying to get at. But then there's also a second argument. There's also a second argument for the truth of premise 2, which doesn't have anything to do with atheism or that sort of thing. And the second reason to think that premise 2 is true goes like this. Just think of what the universe is and everything that it entails. It is all of space-time reality, all matter and energy. And so it follows that if the universe has an explanation for its existence, it has to come from outside of all of that. It must be found in a cause which exists beyond space and time and beyond matter and energy and what we understand to be reality. And so it's therefore something that can best be understood as non-physical, non-material. It transcends space and time and that sort of thing. And so the explanation of the universe could only be found in something that transcends space and time, matter and energy, but has created the universe. And so then the question becomes, well, what are the candidates for this sort of being, for this sort of thing? And there seems to be only two options. Either one, the explanation would be something like an abstract object, like we talked about, like a mathematical concept, a number or some other mathematical object. Or two, like an unembodied mind or unembodied consciousness that exists, that transcends the universe and space and time and matter and energy and all of that sort of thing. So now an abstract object does meet some of the requirements because, objects like numbers are immaterial, they're non-physical things. They exist beyond space and time. Philosophers of mathematics and stuff would argue that they are necessary entities because it's impossible for them not to exist, and they have no cause for their existence. They just exist necessarily. But what's missing with an abstract object is the causal relationship, the ability to actually have a causal effect on something else. Abstract objects don't do anything. They just are. They just exist. They don't stand in a causal relationship with anything else. The number 5, for example, doesn't cause anything to happen. It just is. And so, philosophers point out that what differentiates an abstract object from a concrete object is that only concrete objects stand in causal relations with other things. Only a concrete object can have a causal effect on something else. Again, then the number 5 or 7 or pick one. It doesn't have this sort of effect on anything else. It's just there. So the explanation for why the universe the explanation for why the universe exists can't be, answered by, well, because the number 7 did it. It just doesn't work. So the explanation of the universe must therefore be found in that second option, an unembodied mind or consciousness or something like that transcends space and time in the material world. And I think you can see where Leibniz is going with this. This is, this is where he means to lead the person through his argument. You arrive at the logical conclusion that the explanation of the universe has to be this sort of necessary, uncaused, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal being. And hopefully those attributes sound kind of familiar. They are the traditional attributes of God. So the explanation, so what Leibniz is trying to lead you to is the idea that the explanation for the existence of the universe is this personal being, which must exhibit those traditional attributes of God. Of course, he doesn't come right out and say, well, he does come right out and say it at the end, but so if these two premises, if those first two premises are true, that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause, and it's also true that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God, then it follows that God exists and that he exists by a necessity of his own nature, that he is a necessary being and that he created the universe. It would also, one thing, and so there's another dispute in here that you might bring up an objection to. Well, it's like, a lot of folks think that minds are not, they think that minds are material things, that, so they might argue that the mind is a physical being, a material being within the universe. And so if you encounter that, or when you think about that argument, Leibniz's argument here is also an argument for the immateriality of the mind. Leibniz's argument also, not only does he lead to this conclusion about the explanation for the existence of the universe, but in doing so, he gives us good reasons to believe that minds are not physical or material like a brain, but that they are immaterial entities. And they're conjoined and operate in harmony with the human brain, but they are themselves distinct and not material things. So that's another implication of Leibniz's argument that sometimes doesn't get talked about unless someone objects and says, "Well, minds are physical." Go ahead, Joy.
Can you just say that again? How does?
Because of what? Because of Leibniz's argument there. Because he's saying that anything that has, the explanation that's required for anything's existence, ultimately he concludes that it must be some sort of like unembodied mind, and so I don't know that he directly intends to, but he does in fact argue that a mind could be or would be immaterial in this sense, and so he kind of puts forth indirectly, he implies that a mind, because you need something for the explanation, right? And it's either going to be this thing, whatever it is, everything that exists is either going to be contingent or it's something that's going to be necessary. And so what he gets at is that this necessary entity, besides being something like an abstract object, which I don't know if he goes into in his actual format of his argument, but he argues that only a mind that is not a physical being, a mind that is immaterial and that sort of thing, could be the only answer. So he kind of implies that minds are not physical entities. Whether or not he does so effectively is up to you, but that is an implication of his argument. And then,
all minds, you were said.
So the flip side of that is that anything physical has to be contingent.
Yes, pretty
that's
much.
the other side of
It pretty
that claim. Is it
right
saying
because
if
because physicality is a property of the universe, and the universe itself has to have an explanation for its existence. So if there was no universe, you either have just nothingness, like true not anythingness, or you have God, basically this unembodied, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, transcendent being that can have a causal effect. Which gets into it needing to be like a personal being, something that has, all of a sudden decided to create something, that sort of thing. And that this, he thinks of this as a mind. That's as far down as he can reduce it. And I think it's pretty convincing. So, typically the arguments that, for against the existence of mind, will be based upon like, human cognition, the way we think about the mind and how they're typically conjoined. The mind is something that's going on with our brain, and that those brain states and stuff and those mental states they make up the mind. But the problem here is that at the very least, someone arguing that would have to prove that we are merely physical creatures and that we're not just minds. But that doesn't really show that this kind of immaterial, mind idea is impossible. So you would have to argue for that. And then that also, in the argument that the mind is this immaterial thing that can exist, timelessly, that can transcend space and time and matter and energy of the universe. That also adds value to, particularly to those Christians, who would claim that, a person's existence can endure beyond, physical, but beyond death and beyond the destruction of the physical body or even the physical universe. So, but not all Christians claim that. Not all Christians that's called dualism when you talk about spirit, the mind, body. Distinction there, but not all Christians are dualists. Some Christians actually do believe we are. That even some Christians would argue that the mind is a physical entity, and they have to come up with ways to argue that in light of Christian claims. But so that's all I was going to go over today. I know it's kind of deep. Next week we're going to talk about a final objection to Leibniz argument, which is what Joy brought up earlier. Is that what if? Suppose the objector, the atheist, whatever you want to call them, withdraws their objection to premise one. Say they accept premise one, and that those are the two explanations that have to be given for something's existence, and that the universe does in fact need to have an explanation. But suppose they just say, well, the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. How would we respond to that? And that's what we'll talk about. That's what we'll talk about next week. But does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Okay. No, go ahead.
So I'm still kind of hung up on explanation. Sometimes it's and part of what's confusing me about explanation is it seems to be kind of a psychological word, right? And I guess we're trying to not say cause because we want there to be an explanation that's not a cause.
Yeah, because when you get into causes, you get into the argument from contingency, the idea of like scientific explanations or causes and stuff is irrelevant. It's not about saying this is, how it happened. It's just simply saying that anything that does exist or anything has to have an explanation for its existence, regardless of its origin or how it was brought into being. That's a different question. That's actually, we'll talk more about that when we get into the Kalam cosmological argument, which is, anything that exists has to, it basically gets into the causal relationship. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so I guess part of what's confusing me is, there's someone who gives an example of an explanation, and there's water boiling, and you might ask, well, why is the water boiling?
Mhm.
And one explanation might be, well, you applied heat, then, you know.
Yeah.
And another explanation is, well, I wanted a cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, they're both explanations, but, I mean, they don't seem to.
Yeah, but those aren't explanations for the existence of something. Those are, you're offering an explanation for, you know, like maybe why you're doing something, or but here, like, Leibniz is focusing on just any entity that exists in the world, like the water, or, you know, it's the explanation for that thing's existence is either going to be that it exists necessarily, which boiling water doesn't exist necessarily, nor does the fact that you want tea exist necessarily, or it exists contingently. It could have not existed, which all of those things you said could have just, you know, there's no problem with me thinking that there is no boiling water or that you didn't want a cup of tea. So it's just simpler than that. It's more foundational. You are getting into more of like explaining why a person does something or that sort of thing. So that would, I guess, get more into just the causal principles of things. You caused the water to boil, and you did it for this reason. I don't think those really apply to this particular argument.
But is it fair to say that in the causal, or at least in this argument, you're bringing in both like time and physicality? I guess that, like, those are. You're
saying that those things need an explanation.
We're
for
associating that with the it has a cause, so that automatically makes it something that like exists in time and space. And
you're not necessarily saying that it has to have a cause with this argument. Leibniz would say you're just saying that it needs a reason for its existence. Like Leibniz was actually totally fine with you saying the universe is eternal. Mm-hmm. It has no cause, essentially. But he would still say that thing, the fact that the universe exists and does not exist, you would have to explain what is the explanation for the universe's existence rather than its non-existence, because it's totally, you know, you can imagine just that the universe doesn't exist. Now that does get into, well, what is the cause? But he would say that's a totally separate argument. He's simply saying everything needs an explanation for its existence, and that explanation is going to be one of two reasons.
Yeah,
and that's
all
he's
I'm trying to differentiate between how he's using explanation versus cause, which to me was part of what.
I think so. I mean, I understand that because that's the same thing that I get into. But that's where my mind goes too. But because I asked that question, and other people asked that question. And it's just been hammered down in my mind that this is not something, this Leibniz argument would say whatever that cause is or whatever that origin story is irrelevant. It's just that he wants you to understand everything that exists has to have an explanation, and it's going to be either one of these two reasons. It's either contingent, it didn't have to exist, and something made it happen, whatever that might have been. Or it exists necessarily. It's impossible for that thing not to exist. And we will get into cause, particularly with the universe, specifically when we go to another one of the arguments for God's existence, which is the cosmological argument, or it's sometimes called the Kalam cosmological argument, due to the Islamic medieval scholars who first kind of brought it about. That's what Kalam means. It's an Islamic word for, I forget now, I'm drawing a blank. It's a word for like the Islamic medieval scholastic stuff. I can't remember what it means now. But we will get into, so it may be hard. I'm just kind of used to it at this point, but we're thinking of the fact that something has needs an explanation for its existence is not necessarily the same thing as saying, well, what is the cause? I mean, we do want to know, obviously there is a cause for a contingent entity. That's the whole point of it being contingent. Something caused it or brought it into existence. So there's a cause there. There's that relationship. But with a necessary being, there's not. There is no cause. We don't know what that is. He would just stop it. It's a necessary being. Is any of this helpful, Joey? Keep going. That's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Slight change of topic.
Sure.
That's okay.
No,
So,
yeah.
I know we keep talking about God as a necessary being, but I kind of lose grip of what that means. So, like this God that we're talking about as a necessary being, could it be Zeus, right? Or could it be, what other gods are there?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, I guess you could call it whatever you want, but Zeus wouldn't be a necessary being. From what I understand from Greek mythology, Zeus was even, brought into existence at some point.
Zeus had father.
Yes, and so I think all the major Greek gods actually had their own creator, so they wouldn't be. So the necessary being is just something you logically arrive at because we understand that contingency. There has to be this first, like Thomas Aquinas called it, the unmoved mover, or the first cause of everything that is, that comes after, and so that would be this necessary being. You're not really putting a name on it, you're just saying.
Does that necessary being have contingent properties?
It's a good question. I mean, if they did, they would be contingent no, not properties or nature. This necessary being, as far as I understand it, his nature would, his properties or his nature that make up his being, I think that would all be considered necessary. Now you get into if we talk about God and then we talk about Christ and the incarnation, that humanity part would be, I guess, a contingent property of the incarnation, because God did something that he didn't have to do. God didn't have to become a man, that sort of thing. So yes, in that regard, I guess it just depends on where we go with God's properties. If we're talking about properties, his being timeless, spaceless, that sort of thing, I don't think, no, they wouldn't be contingent. Those would be part of his, his nature, existing by the nature of his own necessity. I think those things would be wrapped up in that those necessary things.
Well, so every once in a while, I find myself feeling really grateful that I don't live in a universe where Zeus is God, right?
Yes.
So maybe I shouldn't be so grateful because it was just necessary anyway.
It was just... Yeah, well, I don't think... yes, I don't think... I see what you're saying, and no, I don't think, I just see Zeus as I don't think there's any reason to think that, could he have existed? Well, sure, I guess God could have made a demigod Zeus or something to rule.
Any other.
Yeah, I guess, if you're talking about, I'm glad God didn't decide to just, create these other powers and then give them,
right. Make them the way the world works.
Make them the way the world works or something like that. So yeah, you could still be grateful to that. I'm
glad that there's not a malicious, all-powerful, necessary being, right?
Right, yes.
And so then aren't those contingent properties?
I don't know. The maliciousness.
What would have caused it, I guess? It feels a little circular, right? Because you've already presupposed this is a non-contingent being, so sort of any properties they have are basically therefore non-contingent. You could look at Jesus the same way. I think if you separate Jesus from God, you say, well, okay, Jesus was a contingent being on God, but if Jesus is just part of God, then he's not actually contingent either, even though he became man.
Right, and
he's still part of God.
Yes, and when I think with the necessary being and God as all we can really kind of derive from what we know of God, and it's logic, is that he is a necessary being. Now, when you get into his being, benevolent versus malevolent, that is part of his nature. I don't know if you would say that has to be necessary. That's a little, go ahead.
Well, so the more necessary you make God, doesn't that take away God's free will? Do we think God has free will?
That's a good question, and someone has brought that up, and I haven't read on that. I haven't read on that in quite a while. I don't really know. I'll look into that for next week because that's an interest. Because I thought of that too, or I don't even know if I thought of it or if I just read, where someone else had asked that question, had proposed that question. It is a necessary being. I don't think that it has any sort of impact on God's free will, because free will is something you have to exist in order to have free will. That doesn't make sense if So what you're asking is, does it impinge upon God that that he exists necessarily? Is that something that could trouble him to where, well, what if I didn't want to exist necessarily? That sort of thing. But his exercising of free will, I don't think it you would have to exist to do so. Does it impinge upon our free will that we were born? Would you think that? Would you think that is that a problem? So maybe that's the answer. I don't think there's a problem there.